My name is Antonia Leckie, and I'm here to talk to you guys about life in the conservation consultancy world. So I've just put my social down there in case you guys are keen, but I'm just going to carry on. So a little summary about what I want to talk to you guys about today. A little bit about me, which is going to be and how I got here. What is a conservation consultant? Of a large focus of my own passion is human wildlife conflict, with an even further focus on large carnivores. We're going to have a look at what a day in the life of a conservation consultant is. Some of the projects that I've worked on so far as a consultant, and we're going to have a bit of a harsh talk about whether conservation is sustainable as a career. We're also going to look at the state of things, but no need to worry about that too soon. So a little bit about me. I grew up in Kenya, so half at the coast and half on safari. I was very privileged. So I was in the Tsavo ecosystem for a lot of my childhood, which just meant that I was really introduced to conservation and wildlife from a young age. I think I did my first guiding safari unofficially at the age of about 15, where the tourists were taking more photographs of me than the animals, and I couldn't quite understand why. So it's always been a bit of a background thing for me, a natural sort of progression. But the way I got into conservation was not necessarily natural. I actually trained as a guide, and many guides will say they're conservationists in their own right. But then I decided that maybe guiding wasn't for me. And I went off and I did a degree at the University of Nottingham in biology pure. I then had this degree under my belt and I had no idea what I was going to do with it. So I sort of came back home to Kenya. The UK is a bit cold for me. And I started volunteering for conservation organizations almost by mistake. I know in hindsight, it's very obvious. I'm like, conservation is the career for me. But during the process, it did feel a bit accidental. I'd sort of pick up what I could. It took about 2 years of volunteering before I could get a paid position. So it was quite a tough road, you could say. I then started working for NGOs and slowly ended up with my own consultancy company, and I'm working in conservation consultancy that way. So it was a slow progress, if you like. Now, what is consulting? In the broader sense, consulting is very much having an external person who comes to the table and they bring in their expertise and their knowledge and their experience from elsewhere and try to help that organization, that body, that ecosystem, or that conservancy, in my case, try and succeed in their goals. So that's the process. And what does a consultant look like? It's such a hard question to ask, but when you say consultancy or you're a consultant, people often think of the traditional careers, say, for example, engineering or finance or those types of roles. So you often imagine this sort of white businessman in his little suit jacket. And I just want to come in there and break that stereotype very much. So this is what I look like as a conservation consultant. So the roles here hugely vary. I can be doing anything from taking people on safari, still as a guide, which is very much something I still do. I can be doing ranger training or, drainage, ditch erosion, anti-erosion gullies, or meeting Maasai under a acacia tree in the middle of nowhere. I'd say one huge advantage of what I do is that I really can work from anywhere, which is such a privilege. So I'm going to take you a little bit away from me and more towards what I'm passionate about. So my real passion in life is human wildlife conflict. Now, this is quite an emotive topic. It's quite an interesting one. The IUCN definition of human wildlife conflict is the negative interactions between human and wild animals, resulting in negative consequences for both of those parties, effectively. This photograph is a really good demonstration of that. I think it's quite well known. And it shows this horrendous scene whereby a group of Indian elephants are being thrown petrol bombs at, thrown rocks at, and being terrorized because they've come into human areas and caused that disruption. You could say this is quite a simple version of human-wildlife conflict, whereby elephant comes in to take a resource which is human, and human rebels. And so it's quite a well-known human form of human-wildlife conflict. I just want to focus here on language, because we often come into a situation with this idea of human-wildlife conflict. There's already that strong negative connotation. And there are a lot of people working out there to change the language and try and use different words like human-wildlife coexistence or human-wildlife interaction. I wonder how and when which name is appropriate, and it's something that's very relevant in this day and age, especially as we're trying to de-escalate a situation. So coming in with harsh negative language can really escalate an already emotive situation. So here, for example, is a lovely photograph of an elephant who, it looks like she's come to say hello to this lovely lady and her baby, when in fact he's probably after the banana trees behind her. But at this stage of the interaction, it's quite a peaceful coexistence. This is another well-known photograph, which was taken basically of an elephant that was coming in to crop raid. So they're coming into the maize fields to try and get maize, and the people are trying to fight them off. So, you know, starting fires, throwing rocks, making noise. And the worry about these situations is they can often lead to human injury or loss of human life, unfortunately, in certain circumstances. So this is another violent yet quite obvious version of human-wildlife conflict. So this is a little bit different, a little bit more complicated. These are wild dogs in the Limpopo, and unfortunately they've been mown down by a vehicle. So it's quite an active form of human-wildlife conflict. Now this one is a little bit more complicated because there is a cultural background to the whole system. So there's the belief that wild dogs will come in and kill large amounts of your livestock, and so they have this negative connotation to them. But unfortunately, in some cultures, that's so inbuilt that even if somebody driving along a road sees wild dog, they'll actually actively mow them over. So you can see that the layers here start to become a little bit more complicated with those cultural sort of inbuilt systems as well. We also, when we're looking at human-wildlife conflict, we're learning to look at more and more of the human side, and that includes people's attitudes towards wildlife. And the cultural norm of what other people do as well is such an inbuilt system to that. So these might seem like less obvious forms of human-wildlife conflict or coexistence. The first one being overgrazing by livestock. So if you have livestock that come into a system and they degrade the landscape, be it through soil degradation of overgrazing, then that is a form of human-wildlife conflict, but we often don't think of it in that way. Another one is logging, for example. We all use wood in one form or another for all sorts of purposes. And yet if wood is there, it means it's been cut down. It means a tree is no longer there, and that whole mini ecosystem has been damaged. So I think it's really important. This is quite an interesting paper that points to that, based in Ethiopia. So it's definitely worth checking out if you guys have the time. I'm just pre-warning as well, some of these get more and more aggressive in their nature of human-wildlife conflict. So this is an example. This video went viral on one of the Indian news channels, and this is just a still from that video. India is quite well known for the urban leopards and how these urban leopards live alongside people, often peacefully. They are often known for taking street dogs or living off rats. But occasionally they come into this quite intense conflict because there's quite a lot of cultural norms against the leopard as well. So in this picture, you can see what had actually happened was this leopard was sleeping under the brick wall there, and somebody found him and pushed him out. And it's escalated really suddenly into this violent situation where you've got people literally beating this leopard, and the leopard's of course going to fight back for its life. And this is what I mean when unfortunately the leopards going to fight back. This man actually went on to try and help leopard conservation later on, which is fantastic, but he had a hard time getting there. So my real passion and my real focus is towards large carnivore conservation. It's a bit more of a complicated story in that it's not as simple as an elephant crop braiding or someone killing a rhino to take the horns. Large carnivore conflict is much more about livestock. So I'm just pre-warning, this is a little bit more of a gruesome photograph for those who want to look away. But this photograph was taken in Laikipia. And what happened here is a leopard got into a livestock corral or a livestock boma where sheep and goats were kept safe, inverted commas, at night from predators. But this leopard managed to come in and literally kill, I think they killed about 32 goats and sheep. Now, some say, I mean, you know, it's a goat and a sheep versus the value of a leopard. But for this herdsman, for this livestock owner, that's his entire life savings that has now been killed by an animal. And so it would be a natural form of progression for him to feel enough anger to then go out and retaliatory kill that leopard. So it's quite a complicated system to unwind, but there are plenty of points in which you can put breakers for the system. So if you can teach the herdsman or the livestock owner how to better protect his livestock at night, that's a breaker of the system. If you can build a better boma or a livestock corral that hopefully protects them in a better way, that's another breaker to the system. And so this system is relatively easy in terms of trying to prevent that large carnivore human conflict. So there are multiple dimensions to large carnivore conflict. Here I'm looking at a specific one from lions, so human-lion conflict. So we've got the very obvious carnivore dimension. You know, what are the lions like? How are they coping in the ecosystem? How many of them are there? And I would say traditionally conservation and conservation biologists were very good at focusing on this particular dimension. And by that, I mean, we've all been part of or heard of a lion count or a large carnivore count, where people try and assess how many carnivores there are in their space. And we've all heard of individual, quote unquote, problem animals. That word we're going to try and avoid using from now on. But this dimension has been focused on in quite a strong way. There's also the livestock dimension. I mean, are there more livestock in the fields than there are wild prey, for example? If a lion walks in a straight line, is he going to bump into livestock more often than prey? And therefore, the chances are he's going to take livestock more often. There's also the element of protection. Are they being herded properly? Are they being put in a livestock corral properly? There's a whole factor of new things coming into this dimension, which are of real interest. For example, with the development of technology and with reception expanding. So there's availability of data, mobile data in such remote areas. I've actually seen a situation whereby a herdsman who's meant to be looking after cows is on his phone scrolling through Facebook with his earphones in, unable to see the lion that is eating one of the cows. And so there's a lot of different factors in itself coming into that. And then in terms of wild prey dimension, I mean, this is another, if a lion's walking a straight line, if it hits more prey on its path, it's more likely to take those prey. It's also about what type of prey is available in the system. If the lion pride is a pride of 28, for example, they may find taking down a buffalo very easy. But if it's a nomadic male who's moving out of his pride, he's going to really struggle to take down a bigger animal. But if he can find a smaller animal, like an impala, for example, then he'll be more likely to choose an impala over a livestock. So it all's quite complicated and ties into each other. The human dimension we very much discussed in terms of people's attitudes towards lion. We're in a very lucky place in Kenya whereby people, the general public is very proud of our large carnivore population. So if you go to someone in Nairobi, for example, they did a study whereby people literally showed their attitude was pride towards their symbolic lions, for example. So there is that drive to protect, but we also have to look at the humans on the ground who are dealing with the conflict day in, day out. And that's a really interesting aspect. And then, of course, we have the environmental dimension of that space. So this picture, this diagram actually comes from a very interesting paper, which was a review paper examining all the publications that they could find on human-lion conflict. And basically what they found is that the vast majority of papers published were published by conservation biologists, very much, or zoologists, very much focusing on the carnivore dimension and perhaps the wild prey dimension. So what we're really missing in conservation is that human dimension. We need more conservation psychologists and anthropologists and the like to come in with that expertise of the other side, the other dimension of this system. Human-lion conflict, or any form of human-wildlife conflict, the human element is so strong in here, and yet it's so understudied and underdeveloped. So having said this, there are universities out there who are developing, excuse me, who are developing this side of their disciplinaries that they're offering to students, but it's a slow process. It's very much an up and coming field. So moving away from the sort of human wildlife conflict side of things and more back to me. So my co-owned company is called Leckie Nature Consultants. And a day in the life of this company is hugely varied. I would highly recommend, the ability to juggle many different balls, all flying at different heights and speeds and shapes and colors. Then you'll be great at this sort of type of work. But day in, day out, I would say almost no 2 days look the same. There's a lot of field work mixed with computer work, but we could be, as I said, sitting under a tree in the Masai Mara, talking to local landowners about the policies of how to manage conflict mitigation, or we could be planting trees to try and combat soil erosion. And so it's hugely varied. I'm not sure I could describe an exact day in my life to anyone in particular, but it's fantastic in that way. It really is a brilliant way to do things. I just want to talk about a few projects that I've done so far, and that we've done so far. And we really started off the company with a lot of ranger training. So we've done a lot of ranger training for conservancies and ranches in the Taita Taveta space, which is in the greater Sava ecosystem in southern central Kenya. And this is really what kickstarted our progression. This is where my sort of passion lies as well, in promoting boots on the ground with the knowledge of not just data collection, but why they are collecting the data that they are collecting. One of the more varied topics that we've done, or projects that we've done, was the tourism circuit plan for the Taita Taveta Wildlife Conservancies Association. This was very different to anything we've done, but it was very fun. It was essentially taking the less used, less well-known space of Taita Taveta and trying to come up with a system, a way that tourists can navigate the landscape and enjoy the various aspects, be it from the cultural perspectives, the protected area perspectives, and the activities that were available in that space. That was a very fun project that involved a lot of driving around and enjoying the sights and sounds. We've also worked on some more intensive management and action plans for some ranches that are converting into conservancies, and trying to show them, maybe their different options, or perhaps a more sustainable way of doing certain aspects or activities on their spaces. We're currently working in the Greater Mara at Isaten Conservancy. This is a very all-round job whereby we're looking at effectively setting up the conservancy from scratch, whereby we're recruiting the proper positions like a conservancy manager, setting up the systems, training the rangers, creating the data collection systems, and helping them to develop a more sustainable land use as well. So, quite an interesting one. Is conservation a sustainable career? Well, I mean, when I was getting into conservation, it did take, honestly, 2 years of volunteering without pay. And once I was on pay, it was very limited and very difficult to survive on that funding. as I developed and learned more things and progressed, and then was luckily able to do this conservation consultancy instead of necessarily working for an NGO or a CBO, a community-based organization, then I was able to perhaps consider what my value and my worth was, and perhaps I was more able to ask for that, and it was up to clients to decline or accept that. And so that became more sustainable. But I would say in a very honest way that you are putting in a lot of hours and a lot of time, and you're not going to be making huge amounts of money until you are running bigger organizations. To completely counter that, I mean, I'm so passionate about this career, and this is where I want to be and what I want to be doing. And those moments of gratification when you've been looking after a pride of lions for 2 years and they have cubs successfully in an area where they've never been able to do that. Those moments are just so morale boosting that I don't believe that I would be happy doing anything else. But it's a very individual choice. If anyone is considering a career in conservation or considering continuing a career in conservation, it is very difficult. It's tough out there. It's not an easy world. So as long as you go in with your eyes wide open, then good luck. Now I just want to zoom out again and just look a little bit at, okay, we're talking about conservation, and why on earth do we need to care? Why do we need to have a look at things? And I'm sure everyone on this podcast is already fairly aware of things like, for example, we're experiencing warmer and warmer temperatures every year, for like as seen in this diagram from NASA Earth Observatory. There are lots of interesting reports on the global state of things. They're quite intense, but I'd always recommend a read or a skim of the abstracts if you can. We're seeing more and more abnormalities in temperature. So whether that be cold or hot, we're seeing more of a contrast than they used to be. Unfortunately, with all these fantastic UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're finding it harder and harder to hit the goals that we've already set. And yet it often feels like the politics and the governments and the UN bodies are setting higher and bigger and harder achievements for the future. And sometimes it does feel like, how on earth are we going to be able to cope with this if we haven't even managed to achieve what we were meant to achieve 10 years ago? We're also seeing as countries are industrializing and their economies are growing, we're seeing the peak pollution effect. So as the economy is increasing, the amount of pollution is actually increasing until the post-industrial economic situation, whereby we are seeing a decrease in pollution. But a lot of the world, the vast majority of the world, you could say is a pre-industrial state or industrializing state. And so we still have a huge problem ahead of us in terms of pollution alone. Okay, that's all very depressing, and I'm so sorry, but we need to be reminded of why we're here. I'm going to zoom in again and talk about Kenya, just because this is where my expertise and my passion lies. And I'm going to focus in on some of the details from a report written by the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association. Now, this is based on conservancies rather than government protected areas, but very much the same principles apply. So in Kenya, and this is very Kenya oriented, what we're seeing is for conservancies, the major threats include land use change, land degradation, human-wildlife conflicts, as we've spoken a lot about, poaching, which I would argue here is a human-wildlife conflict, but that's okay. Inadequate social and economic benefits for not only the communities, but the people working within these conservancies, poor governance, unfortunately, insecure land tenure, whereby a conservancy can then be converted into something else, or whereby individuals can withdraw their land from conservancies. And then, of course, we've got the more political side of things with policies and law enforcement. Now, this next section is a little bit heavy, so my apologies, as it's more of an evening presentation. So I'm going to run through these quite quickly. But in general, this report recommends that the way forward is to increase social and economic investment, incentivize landowners so that people don't pull out of these conservancies, strengthen conservancy management, and a bit of strengthening the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association, training of community scouts, which is a very basic thing that we often get involved with, trying to involve the Kenya Wildlife Service, strengthening planning at an ecosystem level. For example, the Mara ecosystem is very good at that type of planning. Promote investments in livestock, so to try and move away from, for example, poorer breeds and moves towards much stronger breeds, which are drought resistant and better protected. Invest in rangelands management, which has often, unfortunately, been ignored, whereas it's now getting priority. Recognize different versions of land use, reduce human-wildlife conflicts, etc., etc., etc. So I just want to perhaps focus on one of the key points there, and that was to do with the land, improving the current conservancies rather than expanding. So this is quite an interesting paper, which was done by a Kenyan master's student. And I'm just going to talk you through these maps here. So this top left-hand side map basically shows all the conservancies and protected areas are in red. They're outlined in red. And then all the areas that are in gray are excluded from the project. Either they're less habitable for wildlife because they're built up areas, or they're desert effectively. And then all the areas that include those protected areas, but also those well-known wildlife areas or corridors. So what this paper did is it looked at biodiversity richness, and that was through vulnerable tree species and plant species, all your large mammals, and then smaller things, inverted commas, like birds and frogs, etc., and basically built this species richness across the Kenyan landscape. And what we get here is this map on the right, which basically shows the selection frequency for that species richness across all the areas that were in green previously. Now, what that means is basically if we took the richest areas and we focused on them, they would be within this space here on this lower map down here. So as you can see, a lot of that is actually outside of protected areas and national parks and national reserves. What that means, unfortunately, is that actually a lot of our species richness is not as high as it could be inside of national parks and protected areas compared with outside of national parks and protected areas. And this final graph on the right here is a bit more of a detailed map with the selection frequency on that. Now, this interestingly corresponds to the KWS Kenya Wildlife Service approximation that 75% of wildlife lives outside of protected areas, which basically means that, okay, we could expand into these areas, but actually, what if we looked at the areas we're already protecting and just tried to improve the management and the governance within those areas to improve the species biodiversity richness? I just felt that was a really lovely way of illustrating that point. Okay, so I've thrown a lot of different aspects here at you guys. And I just want to emphasize with this beautiful photograph that there's no point in getting bogged down. It's really easy to wake up in the morning and read the news, and there's another oil spill, or there's another deadly fire. And we really need to be aware of this and step back and maybe not get bogged down too much by these things. Perhaps some personal advice from someone such as myself who's trying to save the world or at least make as much difference as I can, is to go out and try and handle it in bite-sized pieces. Take those little aspects that you can help with, that you can make a change towards, and use them. Try not to focus too much on the global picture, because then it just feels overwhelming and unmotivating. So that's my little advice. Don't get lost in the blue. So I hope that wasn't too fast, but yeah, thank you guys very much. I just want to say, like, it's an absolutely fantastic career, and I feel very privileged. And as always, I'd love to, if you guys want some questions and another time outside of this Q&A session, I've just left my details there. Like, please feel free to message or email. I'd love to help out if I can. So yeah, I think that's me done.
Thank you so much, Auntie. That was such a fantastic talk. And thank you as well very much for your candor. I know that sometimes conservation can be a pretty pretty eye-opening career. I know I myself also struggled with that sense of not having a lot of hope, because it does seem a bit dreary sometimes. But absolutely, just, yes, like you said, take everything in bite-sized pieces. And also, although I am very biased, but I think one of the great things about Unlocking Nature is that we do have so many incredible people from all walks of life from all over Africa telling really cool and interesting and often very positive stories about conservation. So it also helps to seek out the wins, the little wins that you can find. And I feel like that really helps me get up in the morning. So thank you so much for all of that. We have got some questions in the chat, so I'll start off reading those out. And then again, if anyone has any other questions, if you'd like to read your question out loud, please do put your hand up. Otherwise, feel free to pop them in the chat. So let's get going. So we've got a question here from Andre de George in the chat. Will Kenya ever reopen hunting? There's a lot of areas outside of Kenya's parks that could benefit local communities and private ranchers that would increase their tolerance of coexisting with wildlife.
Wow, you really hit me with the hard one, hey? Straight
Yep,
away.
right out the gate.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm coming at this from a perspective of a Kenyan that was brought up when by the time I was anywhere conscious or involved in wildlife, hunting had long been banned. And my father and I often have this debate, partly because of that time difference. But effectively, I feel like Kenya has succeeded this far and this long. And okay, of course, there's a lot of improvements that can be done, but we've managed to conserve without that necessity for hunting so far. So my question is, why would you introduce it? There is, of course, that debate about income into these remote areas. But to counter that, I think the donor model is effective. It's been effective enough for organizations like the Kenya Wildlife Service to continue their work they're doing, and other larger organizations to come in and support that system as well. So I would say there's enough space for hunting in the world that we don't need to bring it into Kenya. Let's try another model and keep seeing if it survives the way it does. We're also learning that there are much more interactive and sustainable, long-term sustainable methods of involving communities that aren't monetary. If you hand out money in the way that hunting often does, it's a very short-term model whereby if that income source disappears, that community is not invested in conservation. So we are learning that there are more effective models to get those communities to coexist with wildlife outside of protected areas without that direct financial monetary bribe, I'm going to call it very controversially here, of hunting. But by all means, for the areas that hunting works, then it works, and removing hunting in those areas would cause a lot of damage. Amy Dickman is one of my idols, I should say, and she doesn't advocate for hunting, but she advocates against removing hunting in areas where hunting already exists until we find a more sustainable method of protecting those areas. I hope that answers your question.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And thank you for your question, Andre. So I see in the chat, Andre's just put a little follow on, although I do think you've sort of covered this as well in your answer to that last question. But Andre says, if he's not mistaken, many areas outside Kenya's protected areas serve as rainy season dispersal areas. And so obviously, as long as if those areas aren't benefiting, then that could be an issue. But I think you've covered that in your answer. So thank you for that. A comment in the chat here from Sandra Hardy. Quelling the surge in populations should be added potentially to the list of things of what could be done. But that's more of a comment than a question. She says, wonderful talk and thank you very much. And then here from John and Margaret Cooper, thank you for your interesting lecture. We are writing a book about human-animal conflict for publication by Taylor and Francis Publishers, which brings together published and unpublished data on injuries or damage caused by different species of animals to humans, including zoonoses, and to property, including livestock and economic interests. So they say that it would be really good to get in contact with you. They're based in the UK, but Kenya is their Nyumba ya Pili, their second home. And they also say hi to Ian and Helen. I wonder if you guys remember them from Bets working in quality. So anyway, best wishes from John and Margaret Cooper, and they've got their email in there. So we will make a record of that and put you guys in touch. It was really cool that we've got some
Thank
old
you.
friends on here. So that's
Yeah.
really lovely.
Yeah. Sorry, Celie,
Lucas,
just to add as
yeah.
well. Oh, there's a toolbox which Save the Elephants have actually published last year, I believe, which is a collection of prevention methods for human elephant coexistence, which is absolutely fantastic. And they've done a very similar thing where they've compiled all the methods that work all over Africa. I think it's mainly focused on Africa. Perhaps there's some Asian elephant influence as well. But resources like that are absolutely fantastic. So well done for going ahead with that.
Great, thank you so much. Then we've got a comment from Luca in the chat. Thank you so much, Antonia, great work. A question here from Jerry King Malebo. In terms of conflict between human and animals, who or what is the invader of space? Should animals be kept in a park or reserve to avoid this conflict? Good question.
That is a good question. I mean, it's a very tricky question as well, because Kenya is also experiencing some interesting land law changes. So, for example, in the Mara, there used to be this community-owned land, which was owned by the Maasai tribe, or the exact tribe that is in that area. And effectively, what the government has done in certain areas, and I believe they're planning on rolling this out a bit more countrywide, is they took that community land and they said, okay, right, now you need to divide it and hand out individual land titles to all of those people. So previously, that land was not owned by an individual. It was owned by a pastoralist community, which used to migrate with the rains in the same way that the animals did. And now it's becoming more and more of an issue because that personal ownership of the land has come into play. But what I would encourage as a conservation biologist focused on human wildlife coexistence is that why do we need this separation? Why do we need to have a fence in between you and a zebra, for example? And so that would be my almost rhetorical question to you, would be, is there a need to separate? I think in vulnerable communities whereby they're trying to make a living off the land, there are many different ways of trying to avoid that conflict, including a more sustainable income as well. With climate change, we're really seeing crops being hit hard by lack of rainfall before they're even hit by elephants. So yeah, that's a really, really big topic, and it's quite a wide one, but we could definitely cover it in more detail, at some point.
Fantastic, thank you, and thank you, Luca, for that question. Following on from that, we have another question here quickly. I'll just do this quickly, and then Andy, I'll come to you because I see you've had your hand up for a bit. So, following on for that, it's asking, is rangeland management something that can be practiced by communities outside of conservancies? And how does that work if there's something that's already in practice? And I guess one thing would be take down all your fences.
Yeah. Yeah, fencing in the Mara is a huge issue. There's actually a fantastic program in northern Kenya called the Grevi Zebra Trust. Little plug for them here. And there is a fantastic researcher called David Kimiti who's been working on rangeland restoration with communities. They've been digging these smile lines in the earth, which then collect runoff water and actually increasing the seed base for those spaces, and then also protecting them from sheep and goats, using local community members as their ambassadors. So that's quite an interesting one because they've managed to get community to buy into the system. And I actually flew over Samburu land last week, and it was fantastic. You could literally see a line down the middle of those communities that have gone with this method and those who have not. So I would definitely encourage looking into that system.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. Still a lot of questions in the chat, but Andy, we'll go to you.
Thanks very much. Hi, Antonia, and thanks for a brilliant presentation. I haven't quite worked out how to frame this question exactly, but it's really looking at the overlap between what appears to be a really strong climate change movement in Kenya with National Tree Planting Days and all that going on, and where it intersects with conservation, because very often they're treated as two separate areas and subjects to address. Has that overlap been addressed? Are there opportunities there in terms of changing attitudes and behaviors towards wildlife, and seeing really conservation not just as a thing that privileged people do, but actually as part of climate change and resilience and all that sort of stuff? And are there any lessons other countries could learn? Sorry, massive question, but I think you get...
No, massive question, but thank you for it. So basically, I mean, I just want to take that back a step, if you like. And I just want to say that my experience coming into this as a trained biologist who's then coming into the practical conservation world, is that there's such a gap between those who are publishing papers and speaking that very scientific, inaccessible, frankly, language, and those who are actually on the ground trying to make that physical difference, who maybe own the land. For example, a Maasai warrior and his family sitting under a tree who own a parcel of land which is part of a conservancy. They are never going to access a paper on how to decrease human-wildlife conflict, that's published in one of these big article publishers, sorry. But basically, so there is that disconnect, and I very much feel that I'm in a position in what I do is to try and link those pieces. For example, the climate data with the logic. Okay, everyone's like, for example, tree planting day was such a good one. Everyone's like, wow, let's plant a tree, fantastic. I mean, millions of trees were planted all around Kenya, which really showed that investment, that natural orientation of Kenyans to be involved in that sort of system. But what I felt was lacking perhaps in the public awareness there was, okay, you've planted a tree, but now you've actually got to water that tree and look after that tree for 6 months so that it can hold the soil and stop that erosion from happening. So unfortunately, there is that gap, as you say, between linking these maybe bigger climate issues with the on-ground conservation, but there's also that communication gap. And unfortunately, all around the world, this isn't a Kenya-only issue, is that politicians who make these rules and invent World Tree Day actually maybe don't understand the details as well as they should do. I think a real lesson for me as a biologist was how uninformed politicians were. For example, during COVID, basic biology went out the window. And so what I would love to see in these up and coming young Kenyan conservationists is that bridging that gap between the knowledge of this bigger issue of climate change and the on the ground practicalities. I think it will happen, but very slowly. And unfortunately, just to rant in a slightly different direction, unfortunately, researchers have often come in and with such a negative attitude towards the more practical on the ground people that they've actually created quite a rift. And I often see it where I go. If I mention that I'm a biologist, I often get the, oh, really? Like, whereas I'm like, no, wait, I'm a conservation biologist. I'm actually trying to make those changes based on that information. So I would really encourage whoever's listening to this talk to try and help find those solutions of bridging that gap where they can. But yeah, I think it's a really valuable point. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that question, Andy, and thanks for that amazing answer, Antonia. Emlyn, you've got your hand up. Hold on, you're muted, Emlyn.
Thank you. Yes, this is a question about African wildlife in the United States. I think I probably show I don't have an American accent, so I'm asking a question about the delicate issue of Americans wanting to go to Africa for trophy hunting, but not going to Africa for trophy hunting, but rather going to Texas to go trophy hunting for African wildlife, which has been imported for the sole pleasure of trophy hunting in the United States. I didn't know this existed until about 10 or 15 years ago when I was on a trip in the sort of hinterland of Texas and was invited to go out and look at and went sort of safari style, pseudo safari style, I would say, looking at the populations and the landscape that had been copied and created for the sole pleasure of American trophy hunting. I have a disdain for trophy hunting from a moral, ethical perspective, and I certainly have the same view, probably quadrupled, when it's a situation of bringing the animals over here so we don't have to get on a plane to do what we can normally have to go to Africa to do. So I just wonder what the Africa view is of this practice, if you could share that with me.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm going to get a piece of cardboard out and start writing my protest poster. I mean, I had no idea it was a thing. I have to say I was completely ignorant of anything like that happening. I know South Africa's had its battle, for example, with canned lions and that whole epidemic that's now sort of been shut down. It's fascinating that the human psyche requires that system. But unfortunately, it's out of our hands. Perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of illegal wildlife trade, so it may not even be government officials that have volunteered these animals. So I mean, that's a really hard one. That really should be taken up by Western areas. So America should really have a policy against that, in the same way that South Africa put down a policy against canned hunting. I mean, it sounds like a very similar system in a way. I mean, it says so much about humankind, and I'm not, perhaps just one thing to say here is that I'm not anti-hunting in a systematic sense, because of the conservation value that's been talked about. For a moral, personal sense, it's completely different, I have to say, but there is that aspect to look at in Kenya or in Africa. I can't believe that there's any justification to be doing that in Texas.
Fantastic, thank you for that question. Some really interesting and important issues being raised here. I just wanted to say that we at Share Screen have a series that we're doing coming up at the end of May, where we're going to be streaming some discussions about African wildlife economies with the African Wildlife Economies Institute, but from an East African perspective. So that would be a really interesting place to understand how all of these different things can contribute to the economies, and, as you say, Antonia, adding adding value, as you'd say, but also discussing not only the economic value, but also just the intrinsic value, which, as you and I know, is more important, because that's just what we love. That's what's important to us. So just to point that out, more details to follow. Amy, your hand is up.
There we go. I think I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Antonia, thank you so much for that presentation. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it. I'm actually down in Hoedspruit, South Africa right now. And I feel like I'm up and coming behind you in what you're doing. So I appreciate you talking about it here. I actually did a camping safari from Nairobi to Cape Town way back in 2011. And during very fast 2 months, going through 11 countries, but it was a good introduction. We always had local guides. And so I really appreciated listening to all the locals as we went. And I have an anthropology degree as a bachelor's. And I was really fascinated just listening to the issues that they were dealing with that were important to them. So I spent several months volunteering in different places before going home. But I did go home and actually complete a master's in the human dimensions of conservation. So yeah, so I'm finally back on the continent. It took a while with things that I needed to take care of, but I'm back on the continent, and I'm looking for projects to work on in the human dimensions of conservation. And there are a lot that you can work on. So I'm kind of traveling around, visiting friends and organizations that I've worked or volunteered with before, and just touching base with them and seeing what they're working on. Just kind of going from country to country. But I'll send you an email, but I just wanted to introduce myself here. And obviously I love what you're doing, and it's really encouraging to hear.
Thanks very much, Amy. No, I mean, it's a tough career to break into, for sure. But honestly, I mean, you are coming at it from such an advantage point, because frankly, the conservation world is saturated with biologists and zoologists, and just having that unique perspective is so important. And also perhaps maybe some words of encouragement, starting with, a little bit of a negative perhaps, is that a lot of conservation NGOs are owned by people, or run or managed by people who often are a little bit older and have a bit of an old school system and way of looking at things. But there are more and more people breaking through who realize the importance of the human side. I mean, human wildlife conflict, which, you know, alongside land degradation and land loss, is probably one of the most important issues facing wildlife conservation in Africa, particularly East Africa, with just the cultural system there, but in Africa in general. And it's really not about wildlife, frankly, just to be, you know, totally out there. It's human conflict about wildlife rather than human wildlife conflict. And what I'm really enjoying is the sort of the African way of looking at things as well. I had a really interesting conversation at a conference with an American, actually. And they said, oh, why can't the Maasai just live with the lion? You know, they know it's of tourism value. Why can't they just let it eat a few goats here and there? Like, what's the issue? And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I studied Yellowstone National Park and how farmers killed the wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. And in that situation, a lot of it was how they were reintroduced and how the locals weren't included in that system. And it was such a mirror image. But the issue was there was the hypocrisy of this guy coming at us with that attitude. And so I just respect it so much more when you come in with that, right, let's look at the people side. So well done. And honestly, best of luck, because people are learning more and more that it is way more important to have your community on the side and not in the traditional, I will build you a school system, and the villagers sitting there with this lovely new school and no teachers or books, or kids aren't even interested in going to school, but actually looking at what do you guys need? How can we help you coexist with wildlife? So fantastic.
Yeah.
Please do send me an email.
Yeah, I got to go to the convention in Kigali in July.
Okay,
and also, where was I? Arusha, to the Tiweri convention in Tanzania. And it's I'm starting to hear a lot more about the human dimension, so it's encouraging.
Yeah,
thank you.
Exciting. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for speaking up, Amy. That's really great. And yeah, good luck with all of that. Have you got Antonia's email? How can we put you guys in touch? You've got it. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, you have to keep us updated. We can't wait to hear how that all goes. And maybe one day we can have you on Unlocking Nature giving a talk for us. Okay. Marty, I see you've just put your hand up. I'll take one more question from you, and then we've got lots to get through in the chat.
Cool. Thanks for the talk, Antonia. I just wanted to kind of, and maybe it's slightly unfair, but I mean, the whole thing of having to volunteer for 2 years, be able to, before you could get the job, I mean, you have to be in a fairly privileged position to be able to actually survive for 2 years. And just that whole dimension, I mean, why is that actually necessary that you have to volunteer? I mean, while you were going through that, I'm pretty sure at times you had to wonder, after these 2 years, am I even going to get a job? And that whole sort of dimension to it, I just would like to kind of pick your mind and sort of hear your thoughts. I mean, I've never volunteered full time. I've always worked, but I've been a volunteer for 15 years in an organization, etc. And I don't know, there's this sort of almost taken for granted or taken advantage of, which I just like to hear your view on it. I mean,
yeah. Oh, I think that's such a valuable point. Like, so much. Thank you so much for raising that. I find it incredible that this, you know, one of our biggest problems in the world is conservation or lack of conservation, or the requirement for conservation in these spaces, and not just like, you know, ecosystem services, but like as a basic right for things to be able to live their lives. And yet conservation is an industry, I'm going to call it an industry in this situation, whereby people are expected to volunteer their time. I wonder, and I'm hoping someone will do a paper on this at some point, but I wonder how many valuable minds we lose from conservation every year because they can't afford to live, basically, to sustain themselves. Because even once I got a salary, it was really hard to sustain myself. I had to take this is very personal, but I had to take a loan in order to just survive and live day to day. And so it is really tough. I mean, there are two aspects to it. A lot of these smaller conservation organizations don't have a budget necessarily for people to come in, and a lot of the time some of the people coming don't have experience and are gaining experience, and I have also looked after quite a few volunteers myself now, and it is sometimes in certain situations it is a bit like babysitting. You do have to put quite a lot of your own time and effort into these individuals. But at the same time, I mean, there are so many industries where you do that paid internship, and why can't we convert our system towards that? Why can't we get people into that system and build into their budget a way of like, okay, this is going to be our budget to spend on interns, and not just, you know, overseas people who are able to afford to come and do that, but Kenyan interns. And I think a lot of it, so from both directions, a lot of it is capacity and lack of capacity in smaller organizations to be able to do that. But I mean, I would ask of all the big organizations, you know, I'm not going to name them, but why don't they have like a mentorship or an internship system whereby people can gather that valuable experience in order to pay for a paid position? It's a question I have as well, and I'm not sure why. It seems to be a disease of the system, and as I say, we're losing skilled, valuable, talented individuals all the time as a result of this. And sorry, just to emphasize as well, it's not just from a monetary perspective. You're very vulnerable in those situations when you're volunteering, because you're very dependent on an individual or an organization to provide you experience. And as I'm going to pull the woman card, but as a woman in the industry, you are in a very vulnerable position, and can really be taken advantage of in a number of ways. So it's really quite a scary world to get into. The only way I can try and fight it as an individual is to try and be a mentor. A lot of people have reached out to me as they're trying to get into conservation, and actually to advocate for those NGOs or those organizations which I actually believe in. When you're in the industry and you have colleagues all over the place, you actually learn about the working conditions in these locations. And I would encourage anyone to not recommend those organizations that they know are not going to treat people well, and to try and choose the organizations where team members are valued, not just monetarily, but also through attitude as well. So yeah, I mean, good question. I'm asking it myself all the time. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that question, Marty. I think we're all asking ourselves that question the whole time. And you're very right, Antonia, sort of brain draining of conservation just purely for the sake of not being paid what you're worth. So thank you for that. Very interesting points made. I see we've got some hands up, but we do have a lot of questions in the chat that have been waiting a while. So I'm going to go back to that. We've got a question from Stephen Magezi saying, I find that well-managed conservation areas tend to get a boost in tourist numbers, but often I see that tourists impact negatively the wildlife through dumping of garbage, for example, or even annoying the wildlife. Could this be classified as a human-wildlife conflict?
Oh yes, definitely. And I would actually, I'd counter your point and say that then perhaps the management is not as good in those areas as it needs to be if that human wildlife conflict is having that impact. But yes, definitely, you can be a victim of your own success in conservation for sure.
Great, thank you. And then a comment here from Christine: short and powerful presentation, especially for young conservationists looking for jobs. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I've said that, I'll say it again. We need to get you on Share Screen Africa to talk to another of the audiences for university students, people who are just coming out of school. I know that we're, like you said, we both had the same issue where you do your studying in conservation and then you sort of get spat out into the world and then you think, now what? And maybe not as prepared for what life is going to throw at you in this industry. So I definitely think we need to get you talking to them. So thank you. And then we've got a comment here from Yusuf Hassan from the northeastern Kenya saying that the northern part of Kenya is sort of getting left behind in compared to other parts of Kenya in terms of researchers and helping with the conservation of wildlife. What do you think?
Yes, so the Masai Mara has the highest concentration of researchers and conservationists in the world. So I would agree. I think everywhere is being left behind by the Mara. There are lots of very good organizations working in other spaces, but unfortunately, effectively, conservation, where it's dependent on the donor model, is always going to make more money in more well-known areas that are easier to market. So it definitely is a struggle, and northern Kenya is such a valuable space as well for wildlife and that ability for them to migrate as well, that it does need to be focused on. So yeah, I mean, we just need to learn how to get the word out better. Again, when I was speaking earlier to Amy Young about the use of, or the need for people who understand people to be in conservation, a lot of that as well is marketing. I mean, we don't need conservation biologists necessarily. We need marketing strategists who are able to actually market conservation and our requirements. I'm just a bit more complicatedly, for example, poaching is very well marketed, and as a result, there's a lot of donors in the poaching world because it's a very simple story. You can say, okay, elephant has tusks, someone kills elephant for tusks, and it's bad. Whereas, if you're telling a livestock lion conflict or coexistence story, it's much more complicated, and we're not very good at storytelling. A lot of conservationists, we need professional storytellers and professional marketers to help us with these sorts of things. So I do agree.
Fantastic, thank you. And I completely agree with you as well, Antonia. Marika, you've got your hand up. Hold on, you're still muted. Is it letting you unmute yourself? Sometimes we have to. Okay, Marat, are you able to help? Oh, there we go.
Thank you so much, Antonia. That was a brilliant talk, and what an awesome insight into the world of consulting. It really answered so many questions and brought up other questions. I'm from South Africa. I'm speaking to you guys from the Kruger at this really cool spot called the SSLI, this Kuza Science Leadership Initiative. I'm very curious about the project you mentioned about ranger training that you said you are started with and you're quite fond of. It's really just a practical question. I wanted to know, the ranger training at conservancies and ranches, is that a situation where the conservancy says, I have personnel here, we want to learn how to make use of our landscape, our data, how to interpret it? Or is it a scenario where you say, I have people that we've trained, perhaps local people looking for work, mobile, willing to move and help you out for either, working for you or for a period of time? I'm just curious how you go about that, or what your model is.
Great question. I mean, it's a variety of stuff. What we as Leckie Nature Consultants try and offer in terms of a ranger training as well is very different to a lot of people. A lot of people are like, we're going to do military style ranger training, fitness, whatever drills. Whereas I'm like, hang on a second, you are in this valuable space. What about data collection? And these guys need to understand why you're doing data collection. I think rangers are one of our most underused resources because they really are the eyes and ears on the ground. And if they don't have a pride and a value in what they're doing, they're not going to care about telling you about that lion footprint or, that snare that they collected. And so what we try and do is come in with that unique approach. There are a lot of consultants out there who do like first aid training or military training. What we do is we come in and we're like, we are doing ecological, human wildlife conflict and data collection training. So what we've done is we found our niche, if you like, which is a little bit more specialized. We speak the local language, which is really helpful. And then it's a variety of things. So we have quite a wide network, luckily, just from our previous lives, if you like, in the guiding world. And so we use that network. And originally, just starting off on the ground, it was us emailing and calling and being like, hey, you have 20 rangers and, we've stayed at your lodge and we've seen they're great, like night watchmen, but we really feel this could help make them rangers or scouts or community scouts. So a lot of the initial stage was reaching out. And then our name is now luckily in the atmosphere, and so people are reaching out to us now, which is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, so it just takes time as well. We're quite a young organization. I think we're about two a quarter years now. So we are quite young, but I would say the Kenyan conservation community is quite small. And we also went into a space, we focused initially on the Taita Taveta region, the wider Savo region, which is much more underutilized. There's very few researchers or conservation biologists in that space. And a lot of we also kept an eye on the political situation. A lot of the ranches were converting into conservancies. So there's definitely a gap. So we looked for that gap in the market in what we were offering and also what was happening in the landscape. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that question, Marika. So yeah, lots of questions still coming through in the chat. And one of the questions is from Selilo. Any tips on how to actually avoid the presence of wildlife and animals to human dwellings, so more especially for those situations on farm plots? So maybe just give us a quick rundown of the options that you can use to mitigate that conflict, especially around farmlands.
Yeah, thank you, Steely. I think that the Save the Elephants have kind of done this work already for this situation when it comes to elephants. So Save the Elephants have actually published a toolbox, which you can find online on their website as a PDF version, or you can get in hard copy if you contact them directly. But that effectively gives you like a whole range of methods to try, the do's and don'ts, and the what works and what doesn't in certain spaces, be it, for example, elephant chili fences or beehive fences, etc., etc., and also better ways of keeping crops in storage in silos, for example. So I would recommend looking there. For lions, there has been a similar paper published by Juliet King, little plug there for Juliet King, who works or used to work for the Northern Rangelands Trust. She's done a toolbox as well for large carnivore human conflict. There are lots to be improved upon, but honestly, if you know of a person in a space, or you are a person in a space and you're experiencing human wildlife conflict, please do reach out to organizations. For example, in the Mara, there's the Mara Elephant Project. So there are projects working in all these spaces that are trying to help with human wildlife conflict. So don't be afraid of reaching out to them directly as well.
Perfect, thank you. And as a follow-on from that, there's a question here from Luca again, looking at, he's sort of asking about compensation. So you mentioned earlier, you showed us that pretty gruesome photo of someone who had their whole flock of sheep killed, and it's all well and good to sort of say, okay, we'll teach you now how to make better fences, but if that doesn't work, then what happens? What do you think about compensation schemes?
Ooh, this is such an interesting topic, especially as the conservancy that I'm working with in the Mara, they actually want we're calling it a consolation scheme. So compensation has negative connotations attached to it. Unfortunately, in Kenya, there is a government-based compensation scheme done by the Kenya Wildlife Service due to their unexpectedly high occurrence of human-wildlife conflict that we sort of knew about, but they weren't expecting this volume. They are behind on payments by up to 5 years. And so what we've seen is a compensation scheme that isn't working in a reliable timeline, is causing more negative attitude towards wildlife. There's actually more of, okay, we haven't got our money yet, so therefore we are angry, so we are going to go and kill that lion. It's more of like a, well, screw you kind of attitude because it's done so badly. I would put out a word of caution to any compensation or consolation system because of that negative connotation that comes from payments that aren't done in time, or if the individual feels that payments weren't done properly, even if they broke the rules, etc., etc., if they don't get paid, they're still going to have that very negative attitude towards the wildlife. So my attitude is, if you took that funding that you're going to use for a compensation or consolation scheme and you invested it in prevention, then there would be hopefully very little need for that compensation or consolation. So my beliefs are in the breaking of the chain before the incident happens, if you can. It's also really hard to get funds for something like that. So yeah, definitely word of caution if you're going to head in that direction. I would recommend against it, but there are situations where you do need a monetary system in place. And how do you value that? With the drastic droughts, for example, in Kenya, the droughts and then the floods, the price of livestock fluctuates every week. So how do you start grading something like that? It's a very tricky system. I wouldn't rely on it if you can help it.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's incredibly, incredibly complex, but very interesting question. Thank you very much, Luca, for bringing that up. Continuing here in the chat, we've got a lot of positive comments of praise for your wonderful talk. So thank you so much for all of that. And Auntie, I'll copy all of this and we'll share it with you in an email. We've got a question here from Jeff Roberts. Great talk, succinct yet really interesting. Question, are poaching or illegal export of wildlife? Jeff has read somewhere that some countries in Asia, maybe China or Southeast Asia, have started to ban the import of protected species from Africa, usually used for traditional medicine. Is this the case, and is it working and making a difference, or will that just drive it underground?
Ooh, yeah, another really complicated one. I mean, I think it does make an impact. I think what we've seen across Africa is that policy matters and unitedness in policy matters. So, for example, there was one country who decided to sell all their horn stock, where basically they'd confiscated poached horns or tusks, and they decided that they were going to flood the market and sell those legally on the market. And unfortunately, that did a lot of damage because that then encouraged the market that so many people have been trying to suppress through, raising awareness in these countries as well. I think banning it makes it harder to get because it has to go underground, but then it drives the price up as well. So then becomes much more valuable, and the people who are doing the physical poaching will get paid more, and so it's more of an incentive in some ways for that system to happen. So it's very hard. I think poaching and reducing the demand for illegal wildlife products is such a multifaceted approach that's required. And again, if we could unite the African countries in particular, or where any of these illegal wildlife species or contraband are being exported from, then it would be far more effective than looking at this as in an individualistic way.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, we've had some absolutely amazing questions tonight. Thank you so much for everybody for asking those questions. Some really, really important discussions that I'm sure we could argue those points till the cows come home, and we just really don't have enough time. We've already taken a lot of everyone's time. One final question, which is going to be a very quick question from Amy. Is the Safari Quiz book available online? Because she's living out of a backpack and she has too many books. Yeah, shameless plug in the back there.
Little plug. This is my little family pet project. We absolutely loved it. We just put this together. Unfortunately, I don't think it's available digitally yet. We're working on Amazon orders, but if you're in Kenya, send me a message and I'll get one to you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for that. I really hope that everybody enjoyed this evening. I know I really did, and I hope that everyone found that they got their questions answered. There was a really great discussion surrounding that, so thank you so much for being such an engaging audience. A very, very massive thank you from me and to you, from all the LCA and SSA team. Thanks for giving up your time to give us such a wonderful and informative talk. And if anyone would like to get in touch with Antonia, you can come through us. I know some people have already got her email address, but otherwise, yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and hopefully see most of you next week.